That's what's happening right now. This is the Mike Smyth Show.
Hunters help contribute to a large amount of these sanctuaries and just conservation research in general through taxes and fees whenever we're purchasing these hunting licenses. So another great reason why hunting is so awesome and the way that it's set up here in the States is that there's a percentage where every time you purchase a tag, a license, a permit, a percentage of that goes to wildlife conservation and research. So with that being said, that's another great reason why hunting is so important and how conservation is actually helping, keep wildlife here for the long term.
Okay, it's a social media video there from the Ballista Company in support of sustainable hunting in North America. And that sets up our great debate today. Our topic today is hunting. Is hunting good or bad for wildlife and wildlife habitat in British Columbia? Is hunting cruel? Should hunting be banned? This is what we're going to discuss today in a respectful discussion. Hunting is big business here in British Columbia, okay? It's $350 million business in BC, and lots of people are into hunting in British Columbia. Okay, both sides of it now. What a great panel I've got for you now. Ben Hudson. Ben operates an animal rescue sanctuary. He's a critic of hunting. Ben is popular on social media. Ben the Vegan Farmer is his handle on TikTok. Ben, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You bet, Ben. Thanks for doing it. Also on the line is Mark Hall. Mark is the host of the Hunter Conservationist podcast. Mark is one of British Columbia's most preeminent supporters of sustainable, ethical hunting. Mark, thank you.
Hey, thank you for being coming back on your show.
You bet, Mark. Thanks for doing it. Okay, guys, thanks a lot for doing this. Ben, let me go to you first. Now, you heard in that clip we just played there, this is a very frequent argument in favor of hunting, that hunting is good for wildlife conservation, for wildlife habitat conservation. You don't agree, right? Tell me why.
Yeah, so I definitely hear this argument a lot, and I am a former hunter, so I grew up, hunting, fishing, trapping, stuff like that throughout my childhood. But I don't think that hunting is an effective or ethical form of wildlife management. We see through scientific evidence that hunting often disrupts ecosystems. Oftentimes, hunting will target apex predators. And through land management practices for hunting, we see artificially inflated game populations for hunting exploitation. So I think that effective management for wildlife should involve non-lethal methods like habitat restoration, wildlife corridors, and a healthy predator-prey balance through natural ecological processes.
Okay, Mark, what do you say to that?
Is hunting good for conservation? We talk a lot about this. So really, the true answer is it depends. It depends where we are in the world and what exactly we're looking at. The definition of conservation is the things that we do to prevent exploitation of wildlife, which means taking wildlife at a faster rate than they can naturally replenish themselves. And, almost everywhere where we look in the world, where science regulates hunting, we do not see that. We do not see these negative effects that Ben was talking about holistically. In fact, in a lot of cases, we actually see the opposite, where hunting is benefiting wildlife and wildlife conservation. We just released a documentary about Cabaneros National Park in Spain, and it's a great example where the government decided to ban hunting in the national parks, and we documented the devastating effects on both the health of the wildlife that live there, as well as the plants themselves and the other animals. And now the government is having to look at doing a cull of unhealthy animals in that ecosystem.
Okay, Ben, let me go back to you. Do you draw a distinction between hunting for food or trophy hunting as it's known? Do you think there's a difference, an important difference between those two?
I definitely do see a difference, but I don't think that there's an ethical difference. I think either way, we're unnecessarily taking the life of an animal. I am aware that, people in many different situations don't have these sorts of choices, but I think where we do have choices to choose plant-based options or ethical, non-lethal methods for wildlife management, I think that we should be choosing those options instead.
Why is hunting not ethical, in your opinion?
Yeah, so hunting is not ethical because it does not align with the ethical treatment of animals. Hunting relies on viewing sentient creatures like deer or the other quote unquote game species, not as individuals, but as resources that humans should have the right to exploit. And I think specifically hunting for sport or tradition, especially when, like I mentioned, when we have these options, is just ethical inherently because it does require the suffering and death of animals.
Okay, Mark, what do you say to that?
So I developed 3 ethical tests to answer this question. Is hunting an ethical practice? The laws of our country, Canada, United States, a lot of places of the world, our laws, our social law and social norms and expectations of rights and wrong. It's the job of our law enforcement agencies and the courts to hold people accountable under society's laws. Ethics are the rules of right and wrong that are established by a group. The peer group will hold people accountable. In the case of hunting, we have laws around hunting regulations, and it's up to law enforcement and the courts to hold hunters accountable. In hunting, we have the hunting community itself, which has its own ethical standards that it applies to the group. It's the peer group that will hold hunters accountable to the ethics of the hunting community. I think what Ben is talking about is personal morals. And there's a bit of a difference to me between ethics, which ethics refer to the group, the peer group. That's why we have codes of ethics for, like professional engineers and doctors and whatnot. It refers to the collective ethics of a group. Personal ethics or your morals, they apply to you as an individual. So if you disagree with hunting and say it's not ethical to you. It's not a moral act that you would undertake. And you can only apply your personal morals to you as an individual. Even as a hunter, I can't take my personal morals on how I approach hunting and apply those to anybody else.
Okay, really interesting point. Now, Ben, let me just ask you this real quick, and then we'll take a quick break and continue on the other side. We'll take some calls from the listeners here, too. But that brings up a question for you. Do you think hunting should be banned? If you can give me a short answer here, how do you answer that question?
Well, I don't really support bans in the sense that I don't think bans really work because there's always going to be people, poaching and doing things illegally. I believe more in having, open discussions with people and debating ethics and morality. And I do think that public consensus, is moving towards more ethical treatment of animals, especially wild animals, as well as domestic animals. We see that reflected in registered hunting. Since about the 1980s in the U.S., we've had a 50% decrease in the number of registered hunters. And we also see changing funding both in Canada and the U.S. Supporting, more broad conservation efforts through taxpayers and not necessarily through hunting fees and licensing.
Okay, let me jump in there, guys. And Mark, I know you want to respond to that, but let me fit the break in here, as we must do in the interest of time, and then we will come back with more. It's our hunting debate on the show today. Ben Hudson, Mark Hall are my guests. All right, you've heard the two sides. Your turn now. Phone me on the open line.
Show continues.
All right, we continue our hunting debate. My guests are Ben Hudson. Ben, the vegan farmer, is his handle on TikTok. He's very popular on TikTok. Mark Hall, the Hunter Conservationist podcast. Your calls now. Chris in Pitt Meadows. Hey, Chris, go ahead.
Hi, thanks for having me on. Hey, listen, so I want to talk specifically about waterfowl. Now, one of the things that our farming practices have done to make sure that these supermarkets can have all this food for the other way of living is that it's forced our crop production to become massive, and it also, in our area of the Meadows, it's forced those areas into very small flyways for the waterfowl. Now, what people don't understand is you can't just take their habitat away, and those waterfowl is either eating all the crops, or even worse, when they come and eat on the cover crops, when they defecate on the soil, it changes the pH level, which causes the next year's crops to become a problem. So the only way to combat that is through hunting, which is ethical. It's a much less harsh death in hunting than it is in the wild. But that program of hunting allows us to teach the next generation about conservation and why we're doing it, to make sure that they understand why it's necessary going forward.
Okay, thank you very much for that call, Chris. And Ben, what do you say to him? So he argues that hunting actually is good for the environment, good for conservation. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I really appreciate him bringing up land usage because I think as conservationists, we should really be focused on land usage. And if we look at agriculture, about 80% of global agricultural land is devoted towards feed for animals. So if we care about, reducing our impact on ecosystems and improving our farming methodologies, a shift towards a plant-based food system would actually allow us to rewild and return a lot of land to wildlife. So I definitely appreciate that aspect. But I do think that teaching next generations about compassionate respect for wildlife is more important than, perpetuating the view that wild animals should be resources.
Okay, Mark Hall, what do you say to that?
So just kind of on the line of, agriculture, food production, shifting the global calorie needs to strictly coming from plants. When you dig into the science around wildlife and conservation, the number one thing that scientists point to, the greatest threat to wildlife and biodiversity, is climate change. Number two is habitat loss. The single largest driver of habitat loss in the world, and the scale of this is enormous, and it's the expansion of agriculture. I have nothing against agriculture. We do have to figure out how to intensively feed everybody on this planet, but to have to recognize that if you take what I do and where my calories come from, and I shift that and put more demand on converting natural habitat to agriculture production, that's a net loss for biodiversity. It's a net loss for conservation. There is less land to rewild and manage for conservation under a global expansion of agriculture. And it particularly hits hard in the poorest regions of the world. They don't have the luxury of making some of these perfect world decisions, that we're generally talking about in these types of discussions. And, where Ben's coming from, I really respect that, because what he's trying to do is exactly what I do. He's trying to make choices about how to feed himself and minimize his impact on the environment. And I respect that. We want the same thing. We want biodiversity conservation. We want healthy, abundant wildlife populations. I'm doing the exact same thing by being a hunter. So when I'm harvesting my food from wild animals and wild ecosystems, and that also includes harvesting wild plants, berries and mushrooms and all that sorts of things that we also gather from the wild, I now have an obligation. I'm driven to protect that wild ecosystem that provides that flow of my annual food supply.
Okay, running out of time. Let's squeeze in one more call. Chris in Pitt Meadows. Wayne in Coquitlam. Hi, Wayne. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm going to tell both of your gentlemen there, I'm a hunter and a trapper. I gave up trapping because of the leg hold traps. The other day was in Manitoba, got a 6-point buck, shot him in the front leg, traced him down, shot him in the back. I looked at it. I can't do it anymore. I've hunted since 1978, and I don't know. I just don't want to pull the trigger anymore. So I've heard both sides, been on both sides. Plus, I had a brother that ran a mink farm, and when pelting season came, it's just at a point now I don't like taking life. So that's just where I stand.
Thank you, Wayne, for that. And it sounds like he went on a similar journey that you did, Ben. We're just about out of time. I'm going to give you guys 30 seconds each here to sum up. Ben, you can go first. You got 30 seconds here to sum up this discussion. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So I definitely would encourage everyone, like our caller, to assess our relationship with the natural world and our connection with animals. And where we can, we should choose compassion over violence, and perpetuating, traditions or culture of violence. We really need to analyze, our choices and the impact that we have on the world. And if, we do want to make compassionate choices and we want to protect wildlife, the best way that we can do that is adopt a vegan lifestyle and support a transition to a plant-based food system.
Okay. Mark Hall, 30 seconds.
Ben's a super knowledgeable guy. He digs a lot into this stuff. I think the greatest threat to wildlife is the segment of society, which is the largest segment, that isn't as knowledgeable as Ben, that are ignorant of wildlife and what we need in conservation. To continue this narrative of convincing the public that the line between conservation and biodiversity and exploitation and extinction is hunting, that is one of the greatest threats to conservation.
Guys, thank you for a really good, respectful discussion. I really appreciate it. Ben Hudson, Ben the Vegan Farmer on TikTok, Mark Hall, the Hunter Conservationist podcast. Thank you for your calls. We take a break. We come